Hi, my name is Joe. That's Zach, and that's Robert. This is going to be our video for the book chapters we did. Personally, we did chapters 8 and 9. I'm going to be covering chapter 8 with you real fast. So, first of all, chapter 8 starts with the author meeting a gentleman named Bliss. Bliss is back in the day, in like the 1930s, was your average middle American, Midwestern home kind of guy. His father was a doctor, his mother was a homemaker. He then went on to receive a degree in entomology, and then upon realizing how hard it was to test insecticides outside, he had to make his own lab. So he came in, made his Bill Nye style, was like, hey, I'm gonna start doing I'm gonna do these really simple tests with bugs in little jars. He then went on to, by doing this, he created probit analysis, which was one of a kind at the time. And he called it probit because of the model he created related the dose to the probability that the insect would die due to that dose. This had huge implications not only in the insecticide world but in the medical field, where no longer we're going to prescribe the wrong dose and end up actually killing someone, which is pretty good if you ask me. And then cue Franklin D. Roosevelt trying to salvage what he could from the Depression. He decided to cut the government, including our poor friend Bliss. His lab got defunded and he could no longer work here in the U.S. because of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The in comes R.A. Fisher. Now, our friend decided to tell Bliss, who is an only English-speaking individual, that, hey man, I can get you a job over in Soviet Russia. Sure enough, Bliss is like, hell yeah, I want to work. Let's go to Russia. That's what it is. So, sure enough, he gets so starts this story of love, spies, and Soviet Russia, so to speak. So, cue Russian Bliss sitting there, and his landlord only speaks Russian, so he only communicates with her with nods and grunts, and she does the same thing back to him. So it's pretty rough from the get-go. Then comes love. Our buddy Bliss, he finds a lady who happens to know American and Russian, so she basically is his gateway to be able to buy groceries and talk to anyone else in Russia, I suppose. Soon, though, he came under fire by the Russian government because it's Stalin's regime, right? And they're all very, very wary about their about sciences and stuff. So they come in, they're like, hey, we think you're a spy. And he's like, I'm not a spy. And he's like, I'll tell you everything you want to know. Literally tells them everything they ask. And he's like, well, there's no way he's a spy. He literally told us everything. So he gets off the hook that time. And then come a couple months later or something, his girlfriend comes busting in the door like, hey, you need to leave right now. So she's like, all right, I'm gonna leave right now. He leaves. That was in the 30s, and then he comes back in the 60s and finds everyone he loved and was friends with is dead. Besides the landlady, she made it, and they exchange a little nod there in the end.
All right, as Joe introduced, I'm Zach. I'm going to be summarizing Chapter 9, which the story starts in 1930, where a group of many great mathematicians come together, and they're all trying to prove one theory which had been pivotal to most big theories of the time regarding statistics, and it's called the central limit theorem. And it essentially is a guideline that allows you to say if my population has all of these characteristics, then in turn I can say the central limit theorem proves true, which therefore means my distribution is normal. And once you proved a normal distribution, you can do a lot of really interesting things with the actual population and make a lot of assumptions you couldn't previously make if you would have a non-normal distribution. And so in the 1930s, all these really smart people are together. They're trying to prove it mathematically, which had never been done before, but had been assumed to exist. There is a proof somewhere, we just have to find it. World War II comes around, and communication between countries becomes very difficult to the point that they have to disband the group. They can't get anything done because all the countries are feuding and it's just too difficult to get words across borders. And then in Europe in 1934, the central limit theorem is proven by the Lindenberg-Levy conditions. And Lindenberg and Levy actually proved them independent of each other. They weren't actually working together, but they actually came across the same conclusions at around the same time, just by coincidence. And it allowed for these conditions to work as a proof of the central limit theorem. So if these conditions were true, then you could also assume the central limit theorem would be true, which then would also assume that the population is normally distributed. And moving on to 1948, Wesley Hofting, who is the star of the show, so to say, simplified the Lindenberg-Levy conditions in his own way by then proving that the U statistic was equally valid of a proof of the actual Lindenberg-Levy. And so in doing this, he actually had a simpler formula that could be simply done, had less really complicated math, and was more used for the everyday calculations and was a lot easier and more straightforward to the average person. And it would later become very pivotal in estimation theory, and he'd actually be regarded as a non-parametric founder in statistics. And he goes on to, I guess you should start with, he was born in Finland in 1914. He then goes to high school in 1933, and he studies math in Berlin once he graduates. He actually graduates in 1933. And 1933, the Nazi regime is starting to kind of take a foothold, and many of his teachers are just disappearing from his schools. Basically, they're claimed to be either Jewish or Jewish sympathizers, and they were cleansed from the school, so he's had faculty issues the whole time. And he works in Berlin through the 1940s, so he's living right through the Nazi oppression, and being that he didn't actually have German citizenship at the time, he's regarded as like a non-German citizen, which comes with its own myriad of problems. And he worked part-time for a journal run by a guy named Harold Geppert, who was the editor of the journal. And Harold Geppert, basically, it says to him, he's like, well, like, if you don't do something for the German military, they're going to force you to work in, like, fight in combat. So he's screened for combat. It turns out that Hofting has diabetes, and he's cleared from combat, but he still has to work. And he's offered a position to work in applied mathematics for the German army, and he declines it on completely moral grounds that he's against the idea of it and can't do it. And so he goes on and actually flees from Germany in 1945 with his mother and starts working at the University of North Carolina in 1946. And the U statistic is still used today, and it's very important.
So, as stated before, I'm Robert. My job is to essentially compare the two chapters and tell you guys like what we found to be the overarching theme and stuff like that. So the biggest thing that I took away from it was that statisticians and a lot of highly educated people are very progressive thinkers, and as we see, oppressive regimes oftentimes bash heads with them. And so when we see like Nazi Germany versus Hofting, and we see Stalinist Russia versus Bliss, we see that a lot of their knowledge and their forward thinking is impeded by these dictatorships, these oppressive regimes, whatever you want to call them. And honestly, I think it's comparable to like North Korea today or things like that. So what we really got from it is that these two people who were, breaking through in their fields with Bliss in entomology and with Hofting in statistics, and him coming up with him being one of the founding fathers of non-parametric statistics, we really see that it's important for a lot of these like upper level thinkers to have the freedom to pursue what they believe to be true, to pursue their beliefs, their passions, things like that, because that's how we have breakthroughs and advancements in knowledge. And so I think that that's a really important overarching theme between the two chapters, and we agreed that these two chapters probably should be included, or at least the second chapter should be included in reading if it was to be included, because of the fact that the population needs to be, the population evenly distribution idea that was brought up in the second chapter is pretty vital to statistics, and a lot of statistics couldn't be done today without that proof, and Hofting is considered one of the founding of non-parametric statistics as stated before. So we think these two chapters are pretty vital for the overarching theme and the idea behind the proof that happened under Hofting.